3 million years ago, when the first groups of early humans emerged on Earth, our protagonist was among them. At a glance, he appeared no different from any other Australopithecus. But something about him was off, something that set him apart. Aside from an unusual obsession with hunting, he assumed he was just like everyone else. However, it didn't take long for him to realize something was seriously wrong. While those around him aged, weakened, and inevitably perished, he remained unchanged. No matter what befell him, death refused to claim him. Time marched on. Eras passed. Civilizations rose and crumbled. But he endured. Well, not entirely unchanged. Though the years left no trace on him, his body constantly evolved, growing larger, stronger, and more formidable. Through the unending flow of time, only a few things sustained him: hunting, fighting, and challenging anything or anyone he deemed worthy. Cursed with eternal life and unbearable solitude, these fleeting moments of combat were the only source of his joy. For nearly 3 million years, this was his existence, his body continuously transforming, his strength reaching heights beyond comprehension. Eventually, his might became unrivaled, so much so that others began to refer to him as the god of Earth, Mu. His power grew to such an extent that he vanquished every other god in existence, seizing the title of the strongest being in the divine realm. But after that, everything changed, with no opponent capable of standing against him. The battles that once filled his days with exhilaration became nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by an endless void of monotony. To vent his frustration at the sheer dullness of his existence, Mu lifted his foot and brought it crashing down. The entire celestial dwelling of the gods, a planet-sized domain, quaked violently under the force. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The entire divine realm convulsed in terror, sending gods, angels, and even the vilest of entities into a state of sheer panic. Of course, this wasn't the first time God Mu had pulled a stunt like this. Some gods had long since accepted their fate, while others, less patient ones, found themselves at their breaking point. Among them was Lucifer, the second-ranked god in the divine realm, who was particularly sick of being rattled like a dice in a cosmic gambling game. Mu, utterly uninterested in the chaos he caused, lounged lazily, his mind occupied with the same infuriating thought that had plagued him for centuries. He had obliterated every single worthy opponent without even trying, and now, over 1,000 years had passed since he had last faced anyone remotely challenging. Letting out a deep sigh, he muttered to himself, "Being too strong is a problem too." The moment the words left his mouth, something clicked in his mind. After centuries of pointless frustration, he suddenly felt like a genius. If overwhelming strength was the problem, then the solution was obvious. He needed to weaken himself. In his mind, the logic was flawless. If he could acquire a frail, mortal body like those of the Earthlings, he would have hundreds of opponents to fight. Without hesitation, Mu shot up from his throne and shouted, "Dragon Ling!" From the sky above, a colossal dragon materialized, descending with a deafening crash. The beast towered over the throne, at least 5 times its size, and from the way it carried itself, it clearly wasn't thrilled about being summoned. Not that it mattered. Its piercing, glowing eyes belonged to none other than the top god's assistant, Dragon Ling. The dragon let out a low, rumbling growl before asking, in a voice laced with irritation, why it had been summoned. To his utter shock, Mu didn't even acknowledge the question. Instead, he casually started walking away, tossing a single command over his shoulder: "Take care of things while I'm gone." Dragon Ling barely had time to process the audacity before instinct kicked in. Without hesitation, he cast Binding of the Absolute, shackling Mu in a desperate attempt to stop him. For a split second, silence filled the air. Then Mu slowly turned his head, his expression unreadable, until his gaze met the dragon's. The instant their eyes locked, Mu's annoyance radiated like an untamed storm. His unimpressed, soul-piercing glare was enough to make the mighty dragon's entire demeanor crumble. The once mighty creature, who moments ago had dared to restrain a god, now looked like he'd rather sink into the ground and disappear. Stammering, Dragon Ling scrambled to explain himself, claiming he hadn't meant to offend his lord. But surely Mu could understand? There was a gods meeting coming up, and he at least owed them an explanation before running off on some random adventure. Mu, however, did not give 2 celestial rat tails about the gods meeting. Without a word, he resumed walking, dragging the enormous dragon behind him as if the supposedly unbreakable chains were nothing more than decorative tassels. Realizing brute force had failed, Dragon Ling swiftly switched strategies. If he couldn't stop Mu with power, then he'd just have to play the victim. The dragon let out a theatrical sigh, whining that if Mu skipped the meeting, he would be stuck listening to the other gods' endless griping about Mu's behavior. He painted a tragic picture of himself suffering through hours of divine nagging, an existence far worse than any battlefield. Mu, thoroughly unimpressed, shattered the binding of the absolute spell with all the effort of swatting a fly. Turning to his assistant, he barked, "I'll stay, on one condition. Fight me, right now." That was all it took. In an instant, Dragon Ling's entire attitude flipped. The thought of enduring the god's complaints suddenly seemed like paradise compared to the very real possibility of being turned into divine dragon jerky. With the survival instincts of a seasoned veteran, he immediately bowed his head and wished Mu a safe and speedy journey. Smirking, Mu turned and strode toward a small, floating replica of Earth nearby. Stretching out his hand, he pressed his palm against its surface. As he did, a new thought crossed his mind. Whose body should he inhabit? To help make his decision, he focused on the prayers and messages Earthlings were sending to the gods. Most of them were mundane, selfish, or downright dull. But then one particular message stood out. Someone was questioning his very existence. At first, Mu was irritated. The sheer audacity of a mortal doubting him was almost laughable. But as he considered it, an idea took shape. This person, this defiant little speck of a human, was the perfect choice. For the first time in 1,000 years, Mu felt a genuine rush of excitement. He had finally found a way to break his cycle of boredom. However, his assistant looked far less thrilled about the whole situation. For a fleeting moment, Mu considered explaining himself before leaving. But, true to his Sigma nature, he decided against it. Without any elaborate farewell, he simply turned to Dragon Ling and said, "I'm leaving. Hold down the fort while I'm gone. Deal with anyone who shows up." The dragon stared at him, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his massive shoulders. But as the realization hit, his expression darkened. Mu wasn't physically leaving. He was only sending his soul to Earth while leaving his body behind. Panic flickered in Dragon Ling's glowing eyes. "Lord Mu, if anything happens to your body while your soul is gone, you'll die on Earth too." Mu, however, remained completely unbothered. The idea that anyone in the divine realm would even consider harming him was so absurd it wasn't worth acknowledging. He had already made up his mind, despite Dragon Ling's last-ditch efforts to talk him out of it. Though only through words, since physical restraint was clearly off the table, Mu ignored his concerns entirely. As always, he did what he wanted. Then, without warning, the scene shifted. It was no longer Mu. It was someone entirely different. Someone who had just defeated the Demon Lord after a brutal, exhausting battle. The rush of victory was intoxicating, and the protagonist couldn't have been happier. But it wasn't real. It was just the final scene of a video game, its ending credits rolling across the screen as a player sat motionless, staring blankly at the display. That player was a 17-year-old loser named Li Ho. Li Ho, a guy whose greatest achievement in life was clearing every RPG he touched, lived with an overwhelming sense of jealousy. He envied the heroes in his games. Those ridiculously lucky protagonists who, without fail, gathered harems of cute girls while saving the world. It was then that the full picture became clear. Li Ho wasn't sitting comfortably in his room. He was standing at the edge of a 3-story building, battered, broken, and ready to end it all. His entire body trembled, covered in bruises and wounds, the cruel evidence of whatever hell he had been through. With nothing left to live for, he whispered a bitter farewell to the world before stepping forward. The moment his feet left the rooftop, the wind roared past him. His breath caught in his throat, and in the final seconds of his descent, with tear-filled eyes, he let out a desperate scream. "If there's a God out there, now's your chance to prove it. Send me to another world." But before he could even finish his plea, crack! His body collided with the ground in a sickening, bone-shattering impact. Blood splattered. His skull met the pavement with full force. And for all intents and purposes, Li Ho should have been nothing more than a mangled corpse. And yet, his fingers twitched. His chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven breaths. His entire body shook uncontrollably, as though he had been yanked back from the brink of oblivion. What Li Ho didn't know, what no one could have possibly expected, was that, in the very instant before his death, God Mu's soul had possessed his body. Now, the almighty God Mu, the strongest being in existence, was experiencing something he had never encountered in his entire immortal life: the unbearable pain of a broken, barely functional human body, completely disoriented and clueless as to what had just happened. Meanwhile, Li Ho's soul had been ripped from his body and thrown somewhere far beyond his understanding. When he finally came to, he stood frozen, his mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief. Because standing right in front of him, towering over him like a living mountain, was a dragon. A dragon that definitely didn't look pleased to see him. But the shock was mutual. Dragon Ling, still reeling from everything that had just transpired, could only stare in stunned silence. A human had just appeared in the divine realm. Even after his fatal impact, he forced his blood to circulate, his organs to mend, and his broken systems to function once more. It was a brutal, agonizing process, but through sheer control and willpower, He stopped the bleeding and clawed his way back from death. Moments later, the impossible happened. With his entire body still screaming in pain, Mu slowly but surely pushed himself upright. His limbs trembled, his muscles protested, yet he stood as if nothing had happened. But rather than frustration or anger at this chaotic situation, Mu felt something else entirely. Satisfaction. Battered, bloodied, and barely able to move. This was the first time in eons he had truly felt something. And that, more than anything, reassured him that coming here had been the right choice. With his excitement renewed, Mu shifted his focus inward, sifting through Li Ho's memories to piece together the kind of life this guy had been living. It took mere moments to absorb every detail, every experience, every miserable little fact. Armed with this new knowledge, Mu decided his next move: return to Li Ho's home, his new base, and figure out his plan from there. But there was a problem. Walking with Li's weak, battered legs turned out to be an unexpectedly annoying challenge. Frustrated, Mu resorted to moving like an ape, using his hands to stabilize himself and take some of the pressure off his damaged limbs. It was a ridiculous sight, but it worked. After some effort, he finally reached Li's so-called house. The first thing he noticed? A pile of cat poop, proudly displayed right in front of the window. Ignoring this unexpected offense, Mu stepped inside the small, basement-like dwelling and sank onto the rickety excuse for a bed, its frame creaking beneath him. He let out a long breath, reflecting on what he had learned about Li's life so far. According to his memories, Li had only one living male relative, and that person was nowhere nearby. It didn't take long for Mu to reach an undeniable conclusion. He had picked a guy who was not only completely alone, but also painfully poor and drowning in misery. And to top it all off, his only responsibility in life? Attending some place called school. What entertained Mu the most was a particular memory of someone from school who had seemingly dedicated their entire existence to tormenting Li Ho. Not only did this person relentlessly pick fights with him, but they also went out of their way to make his life as miserable as possible. To Mu, this was perfect. A built-in rival? A guaranteed source of conflict? A daily challenge waiting for him? This was exactly the kind of messy, unpredictable starting point he had been hoping for. It was chaotic. It was personal. And it had potential. Excited, Mu threw a casual punch into the air to celebrate, and instantly regretted it. A sharp, searing pain tore through his right arm, like the muscles were on the verge of snapping apart. What the hell? Mu frowned, flexing his fingers slightly as the pain throbbed with every movement. That's when it hit him. This wasn't his usual body. His overuse of his arms while crawling back home had clearly pushed them past their pathetic limit. The realization was both frustrating and amusing. After digging through more of Li Ho's memories, Mu confirmed his suspicions. This body had never been pushed physically. Not once. The muscles were underdeveloped and used to even mild exertion. Even the simplest effort had left them sore. Yet instead of irritation, Mu found himself smirking. This pain, this weakness, this challenge, it was exactly what he came here for. Meanwhile, outside his little world of personal amusement, things were unfolding in a very different way. By the next day, the authorities had already discovered the bloodstains and shattered glass from the spot where Li's body had supposedly met its end. The area was quickly cordoned off, police swarming the scene as they launched a full investigation into what had happened. The surrounding streets buzzed with speculation. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of an apparent suicide attempt, an unexplainable disappearance, and a missing corpse filled the air. But Mu? He couldn't care less. He wasn't here for some investigation. He had more important things to do. Because as it turned out, the very building near the crash site, the three-story structure he had plummeted from, was none other than Li Ho's school. And today, Mu had decided to attend. Without a second thought, he strolled right into the school, walking the halls with an easy confidence, scanning his surroundings until he finally found Li Ho's classroom. Mu remained eerily still, his expression unreadable, even as blood trickled from his nose and mouth. The bully's smirk widened, expecting the usual reaction: fear, humiliation, maybe even a pathetic attempt to fight back. But instead, Mu did something entirely unexpected. He laughed, a low chuckle at first, then a deep, amused laugh that sent chills crawling down the bully's spine. It wasn't the reaction of a cornered victim. It was the reaction of someone enjoying this. The bully took a half step back, suddenly unsure. "The hell's so funny, idiot?" he snapped, trying to keep his bravado intact. Mu wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing it across his cheek like war paint. His eyes gleamed with something close to delight. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the hit. "I see now. This body really is weak." The bully blinked, confused. "What?" Mu didn't answer right away. Without the slightest hesitation, Mu sprang into action, cutting the bully off mid-sentence with a sudden, well-aimed punch. The boy, completely caught off guard, took the hit directly, just as Mu had moments before. But as Mu withdrew his fist, a sharp, searing pain shot through his arm. His muscles screamed in agony, as if they were tearing apart all over again, a brutal, unforgiving reminder that this wasn't his invincible godly body, but a fragile, weak human one. The uproar quickly grabbed the teacher's attention, who stormed over, shouting furiously and demanding that they stop fighting immediately. But by now, the noise had already piqued the curiosity of the entire class. Heads turned, eyes widened, eager to witness a fight unfolding right in the middle of the room. The bully, humiliated beyond belief after being punched by a so-called nerd for the first time in his life, could no longer contain his rage. Ignoring the teacher's yelling and the growing crowd of spectators, he charged at Mu, fully intent on making him pay. Mu immediately tried to defend himself, managing to block most of the attacks. Well, kind of. As he struggled to keep up, a frustrating thought crossed his mind. If only this pathetic human body could actually move the way he wanted, he would have ended this fight ages ago. For a brief moment, he even considered tapping into his godly powers. But to his utter shock, they didn't work. That split second of disbelief cost him. Before he could react, another fist slammed into his face. At least this one wasn't as hard as the last. The bully, still convinced that this was the same weakly he had always tormented, had no intention of stopping, not until he made him regret ever throwing that punch. Meanwhile, Mu found himself in a rather unfortunate situation. His current body lacked the strength to properly fight back. No punches, no kicks, and without his godly abilities, he was left with only one option. In a swift and calculated move, he lowered his head at just the right angle and willingly took the incoming punch straight to his skull. The bones in his head were the only part of this weak form he could truly rely on. Just as expected, the bully's fist collided with Mu's forehead, and the result was immediate. The sickening crunch of breaking bones echoed through the room. The bully's fingers snapped on impact, sending a searing wave of pain up his arm. His agonized scream filled the air, echoing like a child who had just learned the hard way that fire burns. In that moment, Mu couldn't help but feel like an absolute genius. Determined to end this ridiculous fight, Mu took full advantage of the bully's distraction. Before the guy could regain his senses, Mu made his move. He lunged forward, swiftly grabbing the bully's injured hand. And without a second of hesitation, he rammed his head forward, aiming straight for one of two places, the stomach, or, preferably, the balls. After all, he knew exactly where a guy's real weak spots were. The bully was completely unprepared, his body racked with yet another unbearable wave of pain. But Mu wasn't done. Not yet. He wanted to make absolutely sure that this guy would never, ever forget this day for as long as he lived. With a sharp, ruthless motion, Mu lifted his head and smashed it straight into the bully's jaw. This time, the sheer agony was more than the guy could handle. His eyes rolled back, his legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees in front of Mu like a pathetic, defeated loser, before finally blacking out completely. All of this unfolded while the stunned crowd stood frozen in disbelief, their phones out, capturing every second of the unbelievable scene. Seeing the weakest kid in school effortlessly demolish one of the school's biggest bullies wasn't something anyone could have ever imagined. But for Mu, the whole experience felt entirely different. This was his first real fight in thousands of years, and he had used every ounce of strength his current body had to offer. The rush was exhilarating, but now wasn't the time to revel in victory. As the thrill of battle began to fade, the searing pain from all the hits he had taken surged through his body at once, flooding his senses. The sharp, metallic taste of blood coated his tongue. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like even God Mu himself wouldn't be able to brush this off so easily. But then, something unexpected dawned on him. He didn't mind it at all. After such a long time, after so much frustration, there was something deeply satisfying about finally feeling the raw sting of a real fight again. A few moments later, as Mu's rush of excitement finally died down, his gaze locked onto the unconscious boy's limp body. The way he stared at him made it seem like he wasn't quite finished yet. Without a word, Mu plopped down beside his fallen opponent. And for some strange reason, probably because the guy had actually managed to put up a decent fight, he muttered a quiet thank you. Then, in a move so outlandish no one could have predicted it, Mu leaned in, lowered his head, opened his mouth wide, and bit the boy's ear. The sickening sound of flesh tearing echoed through the air, followed by a violent spray of blood. But Mu didn't just bite down, he ripped off a small chunk, then casually spat it onto the ground right in front of his horrified classmates. A suffocating wave of shock and terror rippled through the crowd. No one could wrap their heads around what they had just witnessed. It was like watching a complete maniac in action. Mu, however, remained unfazed. As if nothing was out of the ordinary, he wiped the blood from his lips and continued staring down at the unconscious boy, who didn't so much as twitch, even after losing part of his own ear. This disturbing act wasn't just some random act of cruelty. To Mu, it was his own twisted way of honoring an opponent who had given him an enjoyable fight. It was a mark of distinction, a personal stamp signifying that this person had caught his interest. Those who had the misfortune, or privilege, depending on how one saw it, of earning this mark eventually became known as Mu's playthings. But there was a catch. Not just anyone could earn that title. Only those who had given Mu a battle worth remembering were deemed worthy of such recognition. Back in his prime, being called one of Mu's playthings was considered both an honor and a curse, a symbol of one's strength, yet also a declaration that they belonged to him in a way no one else did. Ironically enough, it almost resembled the way humans in certain historical eras would brand animals to signify they had been neutered. The only difference? Mu's mark wasn't meant to humiliate, it was meant to acknowledge. It didn't take long for the story to spread like wildfire. The entire school was buzzing with the unbelievable tale of the so-called weakest student taking down one of the biggest bullies. But out of all the details, there was one thing that shook people to their core the most. Not just that the bully had been defeated, but that, in a way, he had been neutered. The boy's condition was so severe that the school had no choice but to call emergency medical services to take care of him. Like the rest of the nosy students gathered around, Mu stood there watching as the paramedics carefully transferred his battered classmate onto a stretcher. Of course, Mu wasn't actually concerned about the guy's well-being. What really caught his interest was how effortlessly they managed to summon help with nothing more than a mobile phone. As the ambulance pulled away, Mu casually waved his hand, bidding farewell to his first opponent and silently hoping they'd cross paths again someday. That's when a teacher, absolutely livid, stormed up behind him and barked out a furious order, demanding that he follow him to the teacher's office. The moment they stepped inside, the teacher exploded with rage. He shouted at Mu, demanding to know if he'd completely lost his mind. His voice was nearly shaking as he asked what kind of lunatic would do something so reckless and brutal to their own classmate. At one point, the teacher's frustration reached a boiling point. Unable to contain himself, he raised the binder in his hand, fully intending to strike Mu with it. But Mu? He didn't even flinch. He didn't recoil, didn't move an inch, nothing. Instead, he just stood there, looking almost giddy. His cheeks turned slightly pink, and his expression lit up as though he were already fantasizing about his next thrilling fight. The unsettling side of Mu's excitement made the teacher's confidence waver. His hand froze mid-air, realization dawning on him. He suddenly remembered what had happened to the student now en route to the hospital. Not wanting to end up in the same miserable condition, the teacher quickly withdrew his hand and turned away, making a snap decision. With a stiff voice, he ordered Mu, who he still believed to be home, to bring his parents to school the next day. Mu had been fully prepared to retaliate, bracing himself for the strike that never came. But when the attack failed to land, when the teacher backed down, he lost all interest in fighting. Just like that, the conversation was over. The teacher dismissed him, stating that he was free to leave school earlier than the rest of the students. Mu, unfazed, obeyed without protest and walked right out of the building. As he made his way back to Lee's house, his thoughts wandered. Unlike other gods, who possessed absolute knowledge of the worlds they ruled over, Mu was